Imagine waking up to find America's heartland, the breadbasket of the world, losing its grip on global markets in just 6 weeks. That's the reality we're facing in 2025, as 5 major trade partners pivot agricultural orders from the United States to Canada, costing American farmers over $9.3 billion. On our channel, Top 10 America Beyond, we dive deep into the stories shaping our nation's future. And today we're uncovering why Canada's food exports surged 37% in May and June 2025, while American farmers watch their soybeans pile up and beef go unsold. This isn't just about trade, it's about your meals, your jobs, and the livelihoods of millions. Stick with us as we count down the top 10 markets shifting away from America, starting from number 10 and working our way to the most surprising. And hey, if you find this eye-opening, hit that like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to Top 10 America Beyond for more stories that matter. Let's get started. All data is sourced from statistical reports and is presented to inform, not to discredit any group or individual.
Top 10 America Beyond.
Number 10, the G7
Illinois,
Collective,
state
a
borrowing
crisis
from
of
tomorrow.
confidence. At number 10, we zoom out to the G7 Collective, Japan, the UK, Germany, France, and Italy, whose combined shift to Canada represents a crisis of confidence in American agriculture. In 2023, these 5 nations accounted for $74 billion in U.S. agricultural exports, a lifeline for states like Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas. But by June 2025, they turned to Canada, driving a 20% surge in Canadian exports to G7 members. The G7 summit was the catalyst. When U.S. trade talks faltered, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney secured food-focused deals. Canada's stability contrasted with U.S. policy uncertainty, prompting these allies to act. The USDA reports 52 million tons of unsold corn and soybeans, while banks freeze credit and tax relief hangs in the balance. For American farmers, this is more than a trade loss, it's a wake-up call. Canada's ports are bustling, while US goods sit idle. Top 10 America Beyond urges reflection. Quality isn't enough. America needs stable policies and reliable logistics to reclaim its place. How can America restore confidence among its closest allies in the G7? Number 9, Mexico, a neighbor's unexpected pivot. Mexico, America's closest neighbor and largest agricultural market. In 2024, the US sent $31 billion in corn, beef, and soybeans across the southern border, a lifeline for farmers in Iowa, Texas, and Nebraska. But by June 2025, Mexico shook hands with Canada, leaving the US out in the cold. The shift began subtly: longer customs delays, paused contracts, and vague negotiation setbacks. Then US border policies tightened, slowing logistics and raising concerns in Mexico about relying on American food. Mexico saw every US policy change as a risk to its food security. Enter Canada, which signed a $5 billion trade deal in June 2025 for soybeans, frozen meat, wheat, and dairy products once dominated by the US. CoBank reports an 18% drop in US agricultural exports to Mexico in Q2 2025, while Canada's exports soared 16%, the highest in a decade. In Texas and Arizona, refrigerated trucks sit idle and silos brim with unsold corn. Banks demand proof of market demand before approving loans, but with Mexico turning to Canada's Veracruz port, farmers have little to show. This loss cuts deep, because Mexico wasn't just a market, it was a neighbor, a partner in harvest seasons and trade habits. Top 10 America Beyond asks, How can the US mend ties with a neighbor now looking north? What steps should America take to restore Mexico's confidence in its agricultural exports? Number 8. South Korea, a split in trust. At number 8, we turn to South Korea, a market that once seemed unshakable for American agriculture. In 2024, the US exported $7.8 billion in soybeans, corn, pork, and beef to South Korea, with Midwest farms tailoring production to meet Seoul's high standards. But by 2025, trust in US food supplies began to waver, not because of quality, but due to policy uncertainty. When global trade disputes escalated and US tariff proposals surfaced, South Korea's Ministry of Agriculture activated a 90-day contingency plan to secure food supplies. Canada stepped in with a compelling offer: stable supply, competitive prices, and no political strings. By June, Canada signed $560 million in contracts for grains, dairy, and frozen meat, extending to 2029. Canadian exports to South Korea rose 14% in Q2 25, the strongest growth since 2011, while US exports dropped by $1.2 billion. In Iowa, Minnesota, and Nebraska, farms are scrambling to adjust. Banks are halting seasonal credit due to export risks, and warehouses along the Mississippi are eerily quiet. South Korean companies have cut US goods in new contracts by 25 to 30% per IFIS data. For farmers who invested in equipment to meet South Korea's standards, this feels like a betrayal of years of commitment. South Korea still trusts the US for technology, but food is another story. As Top 10 America Beyond digs deeper, we wonder, what does it mean when even reliable partners diversify their food cipher? Let's move to number 7. Can American farmers regain South Korea's trust in their food supply? Number 7. The Netherlands, Europe's gateway, shuts its doors. Moving up the list, we arrive at the Netherlands, the gateway for American agricultural products into Europe. The port of Rotterdam, Europe's largest logistics hub, has long funneled millions of tons of US grain, soybeans, beef, and pork across the continent. Farmers in Iowa and Illinois used to say, to get into Europe, you go through the Netherlands first. But in early 2025, that route began to close. Eurostat and the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture report a 25% drop in US agricultural imports through Rotterdam compared to last year, while Canadian goods rose 22%. Technical factors like customs delays and quarantine standards favored Canada, whose steady policies and CETA agreement ensured reliable deliveries. CoBank and Bloomberg Agriculture estimate this shift cost the US $1 and tends to $1.4 billion in Q 2025 revenue, mainly from corn, soybeans, and processed meats. The ripple effects are hitting hard. Soybean and corn inventories in the US surged 26% in Q, overwhelming warehouses in Illinois, Ohio, and Missouri. River transport from the Midwest to New Orleans is slowing, with barge operators cutting hours. Trucking companies report 30 to 40% fewer orders, and soybean plants in Illinois and Missouri are scaling back, leaving workers on unpaid leave. In contrast, Canada's shipments from Halifax and Vancouver to Europe climbed 19%, with farmers gaining access to preferential credit and expanded storage. This loss stings because Rotterdam was more than a port, it was a symbol of America's reach into Europe. As we continue on Top 10 America Beyond, we ask, can the US rebuild its European supply chain? Let's head to number 6. How will the loss of Rotterdam as a key hub impact Midwest farmers' livelihoods? Number 6, United Kingdom, a shift in soybean sourcing. At number 6, we land in the United Kingdom, a key player in the G7 and a former cornerstone of US agricultural trade. In 2023, the UK was a major market for American soybeans, part of the $74 billion in US exports to G7 nations. But by June 2025, over 40% of its soybean orders shifted to Canada's Alberta and Saskatchewan farms. The turning point came at the 2025 G7 summit, where US trade talks faltered. While America grappled with internal challenges, Canada's leaders secured deals prioritizing food security. The UK, seeking stable suppliers, found Canada's predictable policies appealing. Statistics Canada notes a 20% rise in food exports to G7 members in June 2025, with the UK leading the charge. For American farmers, this shift compounds an already dire situation. Soybean stockpiles in Kansas are so large that local governments are subsidizing storage. The USDA reports combined corn and soybean inventories at 52 million tons, a level not seen since 2013. Meanwhile, Canada's farms are expanding to meet new demand, backed by strong trade agreements. As we move up this countdown on Top 10 America Beyond, the UK's pivot signals a broader trend among allies. Can the US reclaim its place as a trusted supplier to the UK? Let's explore number 5. How will the UK's shift to Canadian soybeans affect American farmers' bottom line? Number 5, Germany dairy and grain deals go north. Halfway through our list, we arrive at Germany, another G7 powerhouse turning to Canada. In 2023, Germany was a vital market for US agricultural exports, but by June 2025, it signed dairy and grain contracts with Canada through 2026, bypassing American suppliers. The G7 summit again set the stage. With US negotiations stalling, Germany sought reliable food sources amid global supply chain fragility. Canada's consistent policies and proximity to European markets made it the ideal choice. Statistics Canada reports a 20% spike in exports to G7 nations, with Germany's orders driving much of the growth. In the US, the impact is stark. Corn prices in Iowa have hit a decade low, and agricultural banks in Nebraska are freezing credit for small farms. The American Farm Bureau warns that without tax relief, farmers could face billions in new taxes over 18 months. Canada, meanwhile, is scaling up dairy and grain production to meet German demand. Germany's decision underscores a crisis of confidence in US agriculture. As Top 10 America Beyond continues, we ask, can America restore faith among European buyers? Let's move to number 4. What can US farmers do to compete with Canada's growing presence in Germany? Number 4. France, a dairy and grain dilemma. At number 4, we focus on France, a nation synonymous with culinary excellence, but now sourcing its dairy and grains from Canada. Part of the G7, France was a significant buyer of US agricultural goods in 2023, contributing to the $74 billion export total. But in 2025, France joined Germany in signing long-term contracts with Canada. The shift traces back to the G7 summit, where food security dominated discussions. France, wary of US policy fluctuations, turned to Canada's stable supply chain. Statistics Canada's 20% export surge to G7 countries in June 2025 reflects France's pivot, with dairy and grain contracts locking in through 2026. American farmers are reeling. Soybean inventories in Kansas and corn in Iowa are at critical levels, with storage subsidies straining local budgets. Cold storage projects for European markets are on hold, and rural banks are cautious with loans. Canada, by contrast, is investing in infrastructure to support its new French contracts. France's move is a wake-up call for America's agricultural heartland. 10 America Beyond asks, how can the US rebuild trust with a culinary giant like France? Let's head to number 3. What strategies could help American dairy farmers win back France's market? Number 3. Italy. Another G7 ally looks north. At number 3 we find Italy, another G7 ally shifting its agricultural orders to Canada. In 2023, Italy was a key market for US exports, but by June 2025, it followed its European neighbors in prioritizing Canadian goods. The G7 summit's focus on food security prompted Italy to seek stable suppliers, and Canada delivered. Statistics Canada's 20% export growth to G7 nations includes Italy's new contracts for grains and dairy. For American farmers, this adds to an already heavy burden. The USDA's 52 million ton inventory of corn and soybeans is clogging storage systems, and banks are halting loans for expansion. Italy's pivot deepens the Midwest's economic strain. Canada's success lies in its reliability and trade agreements like CETA. As Italy's ports welcome more Canadian containers, US goods linger in West Coast warehouses. Top 10 America Beyond asks, can the US reverse this trend among European allies? Let's move to number 2. How will Italy's shift to Canadian goods impact America's agricultural exports? Number 2. Japan. Beef and wheat orders shift. At number 2, we turn to Japan, a G7 nation and one of America's most loyal agricultural markets. In 2023, Japan was a cornerstone of the $74 billion in US exports to G7 countries, with strong demand for soybeans, beef and wheat. But in June 2025, Japan expanded orders for Canadian beef and wheat, signaling a major shift. The G7 summit's breakdown in US trade talks left Japan seeking stability. Canada's predictable policies and robust supply chain filled the gap, with Statistics Canada reporting a 20% export surge to G7 members. Japan's pivot is a blow to American farmers who face mounting inventories and frozen credit lines. In Iowa, corn prices are at their lowest in a decade, and Kansas's soybean stockpiles are overwhelming. Canada, meanwhile, is ramping up production to meet Japan's needs. As we near the top of Top 10 America Beyond's countdown, we ask, can the US regain Japan's trust as a food supplier? Let's reveal number 1. What can American farmers offer to win back Japan's agricultural orders? Number 1, Indonesia, a missed opportunity in Southeast Asia. Let's kick off our countdown with Indonesia, a market that once held immense promise for American farmers. In 2024, the US exported $4.2 billion in agricultural goods to Indonesia, including soybeans, dried corn, frozen beef, and powdered milk. Midwest farms retooled production lines to meet halal standards, and some even built storage facilities near West Coast ports to serve this growing, populous nation. But in May 2025, 4 shipments of American soybeans bound for Jakarta were rerouted to Canadian suppliers. Why? Indonesia chose Canada for faster, more stable deliveries with less risk. At a Bali Economic Forum, Canada and Indonesia signed agreements extending to 2030, focusing on agriculture, logistics, and food supply chains. These weren't just contracts, they were strategic moves, with cold storage centers and priority transport routes for Canadian goods. Indonesia cited Canada's reliability, while US shipments faced delays from policy hurdles. CoBank estimates the US lost $670 million in export revenue to Indonesia 2025, with potential annual losses of $4 billion if this trend spreads across ASEAN. For Midwest farmers, this isn't just a lost contract, it's a lost future. Towns where 80% of income comes from export deals are growing quiet. Banks are tightening seasonal loans and grain storage is overflowing. Meanwhile, Canada's container volumes from Vancouver and Halifax to Jakarta, Surabaya, and Belawan jumped 23% in 3 months. Agricultural cooperatives in Saskatchewan and Alberta are expanding with government support, positioning Canada as ASEAN's new agricultural hub. As Indonesia slips away, we see a pattern emerging, one that Top 10 America Beyond is here to unpack. How can American farmers compete when even emerging markets choose stability over quality? Let's move to our next market. What do you think this loss means for America's role in Southeast Asia's food supply? Conclusion. The United States was once the world's breadbasket, but in 6 months, 5 major trade partners, representing billions in revenue, have turned to Canada. From Indonesia to the G7, these shifts signal a need for change. American farmers aren't the problem, they've delivered quality for decades. But in a world valuing stability, the US must prioritize clear agreements and timely logistics. On Top 10 America Beyond, we're committed to uncovering the truths shaping our nation. Like, comment, and subscribe to join the conversation. Together, let's ask, what must America do to reclaim its agricultural legacy? The fields are ready, the farmers are willing, now it's time for action.